Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the stage, Janice Ellig.
So I'm really pleased to be introducing the next speaker, who is Steve Odland, who is CEO of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board, who's leading many public policy issues at CED in Washington, D.C. And one important initiative, and germane to what we're discussing today, is their initiative of the Every Other One, which is getting every other opening of a board filled by a woman. And I am very proud to be a trustee of the CED. Before being CEO of the CED, Steve was the chairman and CEO of Office Depot and AutoZone, and is currently a board director of General Mills. Steve is also a weekly contributor to CNBC, and if you want to see a real thought leader, go to the CNBC and see all that he talks about, from China to women on boards to healthcare. He is really a subject matter expert. So please join me in welcoming Steve Odland.
Well, thank you, Janice, and I'm very pleased to be here to introduce the next panel. But before I do, I just wanted to mention a little bit about CED's effort on Every Other One. You know, a few years ago, CED issued the report Fulfilling the Promise and how more women on corporate boards would make America and America's companies more competitive. So as an economic development group, we looked at it from an economic perspective. And if you look at virtually any measure, women are the majority. So women are the majority of the population of the world, the majority of the population of the country, the majority of college graduates, the majority of advanced degrees. Women drive the majority of economic decisions in this country. Remember, 70% of the U.S. economy is driven by the consumer. Every decision is driven basically by women in this country, and yet women are underrepresented on our board. So think of it this way. Every constituent of a corporation, from customers to employees to stockholders to our community, are dominated by women, and yet they are underrepresented on the boards of directors, which guide the very companies that deal with these constituents. How does that make any sense? So to answer Judy Woodruff's question on the last board, and to build off of Richard Davis's comment, we determined it was not a supply issue, that in fact there are many, many women in all sorts of roles who are very, very qualified. And we are not in favor of what a lot of countries have done, which is to establish quotas around this, because we didn't want a multi-tier board impression. So we have established a new initiative which we are launching this year, which is called Every Other One. And the point here is that we don't want to stop all guys from joining boards. We don't want to kick people off of boards. But if you just look at the directors who are scheduled to retire from boards in the next few years, and you replaced every other retiring director with a woman, you would achieve 30% of boards being made up of women within just a couple of years. And then, of course, every other one is a behavioral change. And therefore, if you got that behavior in place over the next several years beyond that, we would achieve parity on boards between men and women. So it's not hard if you just think about it in terms of every other one. And so we've launched this initiative. We built a master database, and we are seeking ambassadors who will then go with their relationships to people who are on boards and CEOs, and to make the calls for people for companies that are under 20% women on boards, and to encourage them to replace every other board member with a woman. That's it in a nutshell. It's not rocket science, but it is a major effort that we are launching now, and we invite all of you to join us. You can sign on as an ambassador at www.ced.org/ambassador, and we'd love to have you as part of that effort. So now I'd like to introduce our next panel. And invite them to come up as I'm naming their names. The next panel will be moderated by Mara Forbes, who is the president and publisher of Forbes Women. It will include Rosalind Brewer, who is the president and CEO of Sam's Club, Charlene Goins, the former nominating governance chair at Fannie Mae, Kathy Kinney, the former president and co-chief operating officer of the New York Stock Exchange, Shelley Lazarus, the chairman emeritus at Ogilvy and Mather, and Gary Ritelny, the president and CEO of ISS. Welcome, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve, for that introduction. I think, over the past hour, we've heard some great insights from very different perspectives on how we can move the needle around an issue that's clearly important to so many of us. The last panel, we spoke to CEO champions of change. This panel is an opportunity to speak to individuals who are accelerating change, individuals who really are where the rubber meets the road in terms of trying to identify and bring more women onto corporate boards. And I've tasked all of our panelists to be a little bit provocative, say some things that we haven't heard before, and ultimately walk away with not just some new thinking, but also some best practices that all of us can take back to our organizations as directors or as leaders in very diverse industries. So welcome to my panel. I want to start off on the supply conversation. We heard from Steve, we heard from the panelists earlier today, that clearly it's not a supply issue. There are no shortage of women to be able to fill positions if you expand your criteria, if you look a little bit deeper. So Shelley, I'm going to start with you. Your topic you're passionate about, when you hear the conversation, there are no women to be found. What is actually the reality, and how do you, with your very unique vantage point, how do you respond to that?
Well, I respond by saying it's ridiculous. As others have said before, just look at this room. How many boards could we people with just the talent in this room? But I think the way you go at it, first of all, I think the first question is, how bad do you want it? Mm-hmm. It's nice to say, I wish my board had more gender diversity and all that, but if you want it, you have to go out and make it happen. And I'll give you an example of, what I've been doing recently is there is no need to trade off talent, skills, experience because you're like a woman. So what I've been doing with a search firm is to say, here are the skills we need. So I don't start by saying we want a CEO but here are the skills we need. We need someone who has great financial skills, financial experience, someone who can chair an audit committee eventually, and whatever it is that your requirements are. And the search firm is dutifully taking notes. And then I say, and so bring me back the list of the 8 women who can do that. And first there's a startle. But I think the search firm, they get it. And the truth is, I just did this, and the list they brought back was remarkable. Where you look at the list and you go, I would like to eventually take all 8 of those women on my board because they're that good. And so, again, you just have to find a way to get past the usual way of doing things. There is no need to compromise on anything. And a bad place to start is, I'd like a woman who. Yeah. The good place to start is, these are the skills that I need.
So sort of rethinking how we're approaching this conversation around gender. But you brought up a good point, one that we've heard. It's how bad do you want it? It's got to come from a very, very clear mandate from the top.
Right.
So the flip side is, though, if it's not happening in some boards, it means a lot of boards don't want it or don't want it enough. Kathy, how do we start to change that conversation? How do you create the sense of urgency so it doesn't require someone like Shelley or women such as yourselves always having to go that extra mile to say this is something that we have to do?
Well, I think it starts with a conversation, chairing nominating governance committees, and I think it starts with a conversation not only with the CEO, but with the other board members, because I think they can exert a lot of influence. They have networks, they can identify people, and I think you just have to break down the stereotypes, and I agree with Shelley completely that you start with skills. And I think if you can start bringing some names forward even from your board, that these are some very credible people who we might consider putting into the pool. And I think once you get the dialogue started, and I really do think you need the support of the whole board. I mean, the board culture has to be that we want a diverse board. And I don't think you can rely just on the CEO because it is a tough job. We heard it this morning. It takes a lot of time. And I would say the other thing is you always have to be looking for board members. You cannot be looking for board members when it's coming up to the time when you need a succession plan. You need that succession plan ongoing. You should be, we try to get our CEO meeting with prospective board members 12 months of the year and looking. And if we have to increase the board perhaps for one person because we found somebody fantastic, that's what we should do. So I think the whole board has to be involved and engaged in the culture of a diverse board.
So starting to change the culture of the boards.
Yes.
Again, that can be challenging. Charlene, I would be curious to hear from your perspective, when you do have these types of conversations, I think when we are talking about diversity, so often there's the implication that people don't want it, right? And I think many, many boards do. What are the different types of conversations that you could be having with other board members to try and change the culture that Kathy talked about?
Well, I was fortunate because in my case, I chaired nominating and corporate governance for Fannie Mae, and right after it went into conservatorship, there was a new board created. I was part of it, and it started off very diverse. Of 10 board members, we had 3 women, 3 people of color, and so it worked very well. So I didn't have to do a lot of persuading, but one of the women left a year later, and we were down to 2, and I was looking for particular skill sets that the board had determined we needed, because, by the way, I assume most boards have a matrix of skill sets that they constantly update. It's a living document, so that if you decide that there is something that's missing, you add that to your list of expertise that's needed. And for example, we needed someone in technology because that's become so critical. And frankly, I went to one of the big firms, and the Nominating and Corporate Governance Committee received a slate of candidates, and I hadn't been smart enough to do what Shelley did. I simply said, I insist on a diverse slate of candidates. And what I found was that the search firm gave me some highly qualified white male candidates, and then peppered the list of candidates with people who were not as expert in the field, but they were women and or people of color. And I just found that unacceptable. So you go back to them and say, why don't you look a little beyond your database that you've had for years and try to find some new talent, because new talent exists in great quantity if you look just below the C-suite level, but at people who have interfaced with the C-suite and with the board. And another thing that I found that I helped in bringing on women and people of color is to say that you are open in certain instances to bringing in people who have never served on a board. That is controversial, I know, but there are people who either weren't allowed to serve on a board or have hit the glass ceiling and just didn't get there. But there is a wealth of talent that you can find to bring onto your board.
So, obviously new wealth of talent, new pockets of talent. I'd be curious, Roz, when you are looking at these different pools of new talents, what are the areas that you think they exist, not just for women, but just new board members in general, that can provide the opportunity to open up the criteria so it's not so limiting, and ultimately open up the criteria for women? Where are those different pockets existing?
Right, so I think there's a lot of work that could be done in skills expansion. And the question I consistently ask is, are we really marrying the strategy of the company along with the focus of the board? And so we should see a representation of where the company sees itself in 5 years versus where it is at the moment. And it is, as Charlene mentioned, the growth in technology opens up windows for women engineers that are very prevalent and very talented. I think also, as we look at just how critical it is in the compensation area, women in HR roles, and there are tons of women in HR roles, have not been considered for board seats in the past. And we've brought members onto the board that would serve on the HR committee, but not have the HR experience. And so having those discussions and nudging my board peers around what it really takes to make these decisions and really get the real thrust and the meat of the conversations going is to get that talent and skills expansion in the right seats and talk about marrying that with the growth of the company.
So Gary, hearing sort of this conversation, and obviously you're adding a unique perspective to this panel at ISS. How do you guys evaluate gender diversity, and what's the conversation that you guys are having with organizations?
So you might be interested to know that in the past 5 years, the conversation has changed dramatically. There is a very keen interest by the global institutional investor community to see change. Now, most institutional investors, as does ISS, view this as part of refreshment. So it's refreshment of boards generally that allows for the turnover that might open the doors for gender diversity. It's not only gender diversity that we care about, but it's certainly way up there. As you go meet with institutional investors around the world, you might find that many of them, and I would even say the vast majority of them, happen to be women that are focused on governance. So if you go to the largest institutional investors in the world, and you will hear from one in the next panel, you will see that the person in charge of the governance practices and evaluation of companies happens to be a woman. And they care very deeply about equality. They care very deeply in many instances about parity. So you're starting to see these changes happen all around the world, and many of them are being driven by the institutional investor community, who happens to be the owners of the shares, the actual owners of the companies. And ISS in many ways reflect that. We actually are taking now gender diversity into account in our evaluations of companies in terms of what constitutes good governance. And it's only going to increase in importance.
So again, pockets exist in many different areas. The question then, building on what you guys have talked about, changing a culture, creating a commitment from the top. Shelley, I would be curious, you are such a passionate advocate for this, and you're a doer, right? You just talked about how you made something happen. What's, though, the resistance or the challenges that you face, whether it be selling through an out-of-the-box talent or sort of creating a culture that understands the priorities around having this diverse thinking?
Well, I actually encounter zero resistance. I don't think if you ask any board chair, board member, would you like to have more diversity on the board? Everybody says yes. I bet we get 100%.
So there isn't resistance there, but there clearly are some challenges along the road when you do put those wheels in motion.
Right. So the thing is, how hard is it? We talked about that before. So if it's really hard, then you kind of go, yeah, I'd like to do it, but I can't. So I think the other thing is to make it relatively easy, because I think it is relatively easy if you want to make it happen. I think you have to, GE, I chair governance and nominating for GE, and we did something which is considered kind of controversial in the last year. We actually adopted as a principle a 15-year term limit. And the reason we did it was to what I would characterize as institutionalizing freshness. But one of the things that it did, and I will share this with you because it was interesting to me, is that it triggered a lot of people to raise their hands and say, I've kind of done 15 years. I actually would like to step down from the board now. Because I think you get into a situation where it appears to be disloyal. Mm-hmm. If everybody stays till 72 and here you are, you've served 14 years and you're still 58. And so we gave people a trigger to say, 15 years is kind of enough. And so almost overnight, we kind of opened up some room to bring in new people. And then, of course, once you have the room and everyone's in part of the conversation, you go, okay, so now who do we want to bring on? And you can have the conversation about broad diversity. And once it's easy and once it can happen, everybody is there. So you have to create the opportunity. You have to have the proposal that says, look at these remarkable people who we'd like to bring on the board. I agree with Kathy that one of the things that is really valuable to do is to keep pushing the other directors to say, here's what we're trying to do. Please think of people, bring us names. We need to always have a list, and you just have to sort of unstick it and create the opportunity.
Go ahead.
I was just, Shelley, to follow on with your point, we have found it very helpful to get recommendations from other board members because on paper, someone can look like a superstar, but then you find out that that person tends to be a diva when he or she joins the board, and the last thing you want on a board is a diva. So chemistry is very important.
Right.
And if you ask your fellow board members, even if you are going through a search firm, I think it's worthwhile to try to find people that the search firm hasn't referred to you as references, but find out what they are like and how they perform on a board.
I would just add to that, my own experience is if you put out some names too at a board meeting, it sort of provokes people to open their minds and think of other names. So even if we're not even serious about some people, I just put out names at every board meeting just to get people to continue to think about who might be good directors.
Roz, when you do find sort of this out-of-the-box talent, how do you sell it through, particularly in boards where there may be a generational gap, or we talked about sort of digital or human resources, areas that the board may not be familiar with, or that their network, doesn't include those people. What advice would you give, and how do you sell through that type of new thinking that clearly you all have identified as so important?
So, I hear Shelley's point about everyone wants diversity, but I have found that in many cases it's still lip service because I think the numbers would be better. So when we bring in this unique talent, and sometimes they think a woman is unique talent just in and of itself, which I think is absolutely crazy, is that I actually try to, I hate to say it, but when I get the whole list of white males, I just will be honest with you, I'll have to say 10 reasons why they don't work. I mean, and everyone is ready to vote for them, and they all look good and they'd be perfect, but I actually try to stack the cards because, they won't listen to you. They haven't seen the examples. The other thing I notice is that many of my board peers don't have women represented in the companies that they run, so they're surely not going to even get my message, right? So I push it in another direction and actually try to stack the cards and actually give them examples. For myself, my first board seat was because the CEO of my former employer, he was leaving a board seat, and he says, I want you to take my board seat at this company. And, I had put myself out there that I wanted to be on a board, but there were women ahead of me in the company. I was a VP at the time, and he just pulled me up. And I'll be honest with you, I barely interviewed for the board seat. They just put me on the board, and he was just very deliberate about it. And he said, I'm not listening to any more about the white boys. I don't want to. And he was white male himself. He was, the 6'3", beautiful white male. And, he was ready to just grab me up. And I was like, okay, so I'm on a conveyor belt. And I just did it. But, it takes that kind of push because there's still just too much lip service.
But I would be curious, you had someone, a white, beautiful male, who did pull you up, but it sounds like you're in a position where you're the one who's championing that diversity. You're the one who's looking to pull people up. Is the conversation different when it's you having that with the board? Do they ever just say, oh, there goes, Roz again, being a woman?
She's on her soapbox. So I have learned that it is really smart to build constituencies. So I do have some of my colleagues that, I help to endorse, and I know the guys who get it. And so I sort of get in that crowd and say, this is who I'm thinking about. And now they come to me and say, okay, so I know you know this person, tell me the real deal. And is she great or what is, and you know, usually after attending great events like this, and you know, I usually scour the room, you usually know those people. And if I don't, I'll say I know them. But then I go quickly and go call my other girlfriend who really knows them. And then I'll say, so what do you think? And then, you know, that's how it starts. And, you know, so it is a push mechanism. It is, you know, just maniacal focus on it and using the constituency around you.
And it's sort of similar both what Shelley said too. You've got to be the one who pushes it, which is a challenge. So Kathy, I would ask you, how do you institutionalize that type of thinking in a board? How do you get other members to be thinking and embracing this type of approach? Because it's a lot more work, right? There's a lot more resistance. You have to build constituents and allies to get this done, and you have to have the girlfriends to be able to call if you don't know the person that you said that you just knew. So I'd be curious, Kathy, how do you scale that? How do you do that without just a Shelley and a Roz and a Charlene?
Well, I think it goes back to, look, boards are a small group. It's a tight-knit culture. There's a group of people, and we're responsible to the shareholders. And I think, you know, it goes back to a lot of what Gary said, which is what's important to the people who own these companies. I mean, these are publicly traded companies, 6,000 of them, and we have a duty and responsibility. And I think it's constant, but I think this is on a lot of topics. We're constantly resetting ourselves saying, look, we're talking about this in the room as a group of 10, 12 people, but we're really representing a group of people that sit outside of this room who have a lot of influence and a lot of money at stake in the success of this company. So I think it's constantly resetting the discussion with board members. I do think you have to do some of this offline. You've got to find a couple of people on the board who really believe in this in the same way or convince them to believe in it. And once I think you do that, if you can get 4, 5 board members, half the board, you know, believing that this is an important part of what makes this company great for its employees and for the company, and what's important to the shareholders, then I think it gets easier. But you have to have company. You can't just be by yourself.
Do it alone.
And one thing that I think can help to convince other board members is to point out how important it is to senior management and the workforce to see people who look like them on the board. And, you know, I was on a board at one point, and someone came up to me and said, I had no idea there was an African American on this board. And he was really surprised. And I think it gives people, and you want to keep your best talent. Right. So I think that having them see how what the board is represented by really inspires them to feel this is a company that for which this is an important factor.
And that's a theme we've heard throughout the day is it's how important it is to have these role models to be able to see the company reflected, the diversity of a company reflected in a board. But that's kind of a soft thing, right? We know that it is so crucially important, but it's something you can't really measure. It's something that tends to be anecdotal. I would be curious, have any of you guys had those types of conversations, or how do you articulate that to the board in a way that they're going to respond to, that has enough weight and authority versus, you know, anecdotal, but we know very, very, very important implications inside a company? Have any of you guys experienced that as well?
Well, our board looks at all of senior management, not only from a talent perspective, but also where they fall in terms of gender, race, and we try to increase the numbers of senior management, and we work hard at it because we just feel that it's so important. And so I think you can do something as a board. It's not purely a soft issue.
I would just sort of say on a number of the boards that I sit on and have sat on, there's an enlightened use of diverse board members right within to interact with people in the company. And I mean, I welcome it so that the women board members will be asked to participate in the women's network or to talk to groups of women, or certain companies that on whose board I sit actually organize dinners with the most senior women and invite the women directors to join. And so there's a whole sort of informal support group that develops, and I think it really is very valuable to the companies that figure out how to do it well.
So then if companies do have diverse boards, how do you then, what does that look like in terms of utilizing that and leveraging it within those companies, creating that bridge within those companies? You know, Shelley, you had brought up earlier GE and the issue of tenure. You know, Gary, a lot of the conversations and themes that we heard about today was refreshing talent from a diversity perspective. How do you do that? Is it age? Is it tenure? Talk to us about how you see the infrastructure of boards and what that refresh looks like in a way that people are comfortable with.
Kathy was spot on what she said. Let me take one quick step back and suggest something that kind of struck me when I heard first panel CEOs this morning and what I'm hearing today. Boards are very dynamic entities. They happen to be also very collegial entities. There is nothing that says that a board cannot be expanded or contracted. So conversations around boards tend to be about, we have 12 members of the board and we have to wait for someone to step down so we can actually fill that seat with a different candidate. The truth is, no, you don't have to wait for anything. Right? You, as chair of nominating and corporate governance committees, who are extremely powerful inside those companies, have the ability that if you do find a candidate, a woman candidate, that you think would be extremely value add to the board, there is nothing that would stop a board from expanding its size by 1 or 2 as they see fit, if they think that they have found a candidate that adds tremendous value, and some boards do it. What we have seen at ISS is that many boards and management teams, without naming names, use the size of the board as a barrier, right? Oh, I'm sorry, what a wonderful candidate you have found, but we have no room. And really, that's nonsense. You can actually break through that by saying, well, we think this candidate has tremendous value, has a skill set that this board lacks. We would love to see this candidate on the board. And what it takes is sponsorship inside of the board, and can't think of a better person than the chair of a nominating corporate governance committee to be that advocate. So we heard the word sponsorship earlier, and that's what it will take. So that's what we're seeing. So the progress is very slow. So to answer specifically your question in terms of refreshment, it's all the above. It's term limits, it's age, it's the number of years that you've served on boards. In some countries, we've heard before, there's 9 years. In the United States, there is no such thing. There are mandates all around the world in some countries that force companies to target a goal with regards to diversity. And even in the country where you have all the above in terms of refreshment, and that would be Norway, that has a target of 40% women on boards. After X number of years, they're up to 37%. And they happen to be the largest in the world in terms of women on boards. The United States is about 20, as we have heard, which is kind of middle of the pack. So refreshment is one vehicle and an important one, but again, it's country specific. I think it's if you really want to have traction on the issue, it would take expansion of a board, which is not that difficult, actually. It's pretty straightforward and easy, in spite of what you hear and the barriers that you hear. And that will allow you to add a candidate, whether a female candidate or not, that you deem to be qualified.
So clearly there's no silver bullet solution, but it does come down to people championing it, people pushing it, people not sort of taking the traditional barriers and accepting them, such as board size, accepting them as they are. So as we wrap up this panel, I'm going to ask one sort of speed round of all of you. You know, we've had discussions around corporate boards a lot, the lack of women a lot. what's one thing that you're not hearing as part of this discussion that you want to sort of seed and plant to move things forward? Roz, I'll start with you.
I think I'm not hearing enough about making it, everybody being a champion around it, and making it the first part of the conversation and not secondary. And I think it is such an imperative, and it's such low-hanging fruit that the champions, I think, could grow. And I think some of the work that we've heard globally is very encouraging, and I think we can't let our American economy or any other issues bog us down into what we can't do. So more champions.
I didn't hear this morning, and maybe I wasn't paying proper attention, but I think that we need to rely not only on the big search firms, but look at some of the boutique search firms that specialize in certain areas. Yeah. And for example, there are firms that only place women on boards, and I've had tremendous experience with them, really positive. A technology expert was found, someone who had never served on a board, but was very senior and just couldn't have served on a board while in that position. They were found through a small boutique firm. So I think that there's work to be done in terms of making people aware that these firms exist and that they aren't totally reliant on the big search firms.
I think what I haven't heard is there are almost 6,000 publicly traded companies. We've concentrated a lot today on our conversation around the largest companies, the Fortune 1000. But there are opportunities for women to be on boards and perhaps to break down this notion that unless you've been on a board, you can't serve on a board, which is really also nonsense. But I think it would give a lot of women an opportunity to get inside the boardroom, to demonstrate their skills, their ability to provide influence, and to influence not only the management team, but the success of the board and the company. And I would just encourage both, not just the biggest companies, but this whole issue of parity should be across all publicly traded companies, all 5,000 to 6,000 of them. That should create plenty of opportunity. I don't even know if there is enough supply if it was every other one, but I certainly think that that is an important opportunity for women and for boards to reach, more gender parity.
I hope we never have this conference again. No, seriously, I'm sitting here this morning thinking there is nothing complicated about this. We just have to do it. And if each board would just commit to doing it, we would never have to come to the stage again and parse this actually rather straightforward issue. So I enjoyed everything I heard this morning, but I hope we never have to hear it again. And if anybody doesn't get it, just, see us afterwards, because we could explain it.
That's right.
That's right.
Go, Shelley.
I'll turn it around a little bit and suggest that what we hear is that the owners of these companies, the institutional investor community and others, care very deeply about this. And they are very keen on making it count when it comes to their vote. So they are watching very carefully. They are having conversations about it with directors, but they are talking to us about making it an effective governance point that is weighted in some way when it comes to diversity, refreshment, age, term limits, and others. But gender diversity is very high on the list. So if it doesn't happen naturally, or it continues to happen slowly, you're going to see the institutional investor community engage much, much more aggressively in forcing the change.
Great. Well, thank you to our panelists. Clearly, the passion and enthusiasm is there, and hopefully, more people will continue to embrace all that you've talked about. So thank you so much to our panelists.